The Caribbean sun blazed mercilessly as Captain Blackwood's crew celebrated their latest conquest. Gold coins scattered across the deck, and exotic animals from the merchant vessel squawked and chittered in makeshift cages. "Pick any animal for free," the captain bellowed to his men, his weathered face creased with generous satisfaction. While seasoned pirates grabbed colorful parrots and clever monkeys, young Thomas Hartwell approached a massive cage in the corner. Inside sat a battle-scarred dog, the size of a small pony, its amber eyes reflecting wisdom beyond its years. The crew erupted in laughter as Thomas made his choice. "The mutt?" First Mate Rodriguez chuckled. "Boy's lost his mind." But as storms raged and enemies closed in during the months that followed, that giant dog would prove to be far more than anyone imagined. What hidden strength lay within this unlikely partnership that would transform both Deckhand and Beast into legend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Hartwell had always been the smallest man aboard the Serpent's Revenge, both in stature and standing. At 19, he possessed the lean frame of someone who had known hunger more intimately than most. Yet his hands were steady, and his eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that comes from watching rather than speaking. The brass compass that hung around his neck, worn smooth by decades of his father's touch, caught the afternoon light as he knelt beside the massive cage. The dog inside was unlike any creature he had ever encountered. Its coat was a mixture of deep browns and blacks, matted in places where old wounds had healed imperfectly. Scars crisscrossed its powerful shoulders, and one ear bore the telltale notch of a blade's kick. Yet despite its fearsome appearance, something in those amber eyes spoke of gentleness carefully guarded. The beast had to weigh near 200 pounds, with paws the size of dinner plates and a head that could crush a man's arm without effort. "Goliath," Thomas whispered, reading the name carved into a leather collar nearly hidden beneath the thick fur. The dog's ears perked forward at the sound, and for a moment the chaos of the celebration seemed to fade around them. Captain Erasmus Blackwood stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, his presence commanding even in moments of leisure. His beard, once black as midnight, now showed threads of silver that spoke to 30 years spent battling both sea and men. He had built his reputation not through cruelty, as many of his kind did, but through a peculiar sense of honor that made even naval officers grudgingly respect him. He never killed unless forced to, never took more than his crew needed to survive, and treated captured merchants with a courtesy that was legendary throughout the Caribbean. "An interesting choice, young Hartwell," the captain said, approaching with the measured gait of a man accustomed to rolling decks. "Most would have taken the parrot. Gold pieces in every port a talking bird brings." First Mate Diego Rodriguez, a stocky Spaniard whose sun-weathered face told the story of 20 years before the mast, shook his head with practiced disbelief. Rodriguez had served with distinction in the Spanish Navy before a disagreement with a corrupt captain led him to the Brotherhood of the Sea. His loyalty to Blackwood was absolute, but his patience for what he saw as foolishness was limited. "Captain, the boy's been at sea 3 months, and already he's making choices like he's got years of wisdom," Rodriguez muttered, though not without fondness. "That beast will eat more in a week than the lad does in a month." The other crew members had gathered around, their selections made. Gunner Mackenzie, a barrel-chested Scotsman whose expertise with cannons was matched only by his love of storytelling, held a bright green parrot that squawked naval curses in 3 languages. Young Billy Bones, barely 16 and still wet behind the ears, clutched a small monkey that chattered and pulled at his sandy hair. Even old Ezra Pemberton, the ship's cook and philosopher, had chosen a colorful bird that seemed to study its new owner with calculating intelligence. But it was the arrival of Scarface Pete that changed the mood. Peter Hawkins had earned his nickname honestly, a cutlass slash having carved a groove from his left temple to his jaw during a boarding action years before. He was a competent sailor and a fierce fighter, but there was something in him that enjoyed others' misfortune a bit too much. "Look at the whelp," Pete sneered, his voice carrying the particular venom of a man who had never quite found his place in the world. Thinks he's some kind of beast master, he does. That dog's probably got more fight in him than our Thomas here. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Pete turned his attention his way. The older pirate had taken a dislike to him from the moment Thomas had stepped aboard, seeing something in the young man's quiet competence that threatened his own position in the crew's hierarchy. The dog, as if sensing the tension, rose slowly to its feet. Even on four legs, its head reached Thomas's chest. But rather than growling or showing aggression, Goliath simply moved closer to the bars, pressing his massive snout against Thomas's outstretched palm. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that even Pete fell silent. "He chooses you as much as you choose him," Captain Blackwood observed, quietly. "There's wisdom in that, I think." Thomas turned his father's compass over in his free hand, feeling the weight of decision. His father, Jonathan Hartwell, had been a merchant sailor, an honest man who had died in service to others when Thomas was barely 14. The compass had been his only inheritance, along with a love of the sea and a belief that every creature deserved kindness, until it proved otherwise. "Permission to bring him aboard, Captain?" Thomas asked formally. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Granted, but he's your responsibility, lad. You feed him, you train him, and if he causes trouble, you answer for it." As the celebration continued around them, Thomas worked the latch on the cage door. Goliath stepped out with surprising grace for such a large animal, immediately positioning himself at Thomas's side as if he had always belonged there. The young pirate ran his hands through the dog's thick fur, feeling the solid muscle beneath, the steady heartbeat of a creature built for loyalty and battle in equal measure. What Thomas could not know, as he stood there with his new companion under the blazing Caribbean sun, was that Goliath had once worn a different collar, had served a different master, and carried secrets that would soon reshape the destiny of every soul aboard the Serpent's Revenge. 3 days after leaving Port Royal, the sky began to change. What had been brilliant blue gave way to an ominous grey that seemed to press down upon the Serpent's Revenge like a great hand. The ship's bronze bell, cast decades ago in a foundry in Bristol, hung silent in the rising wind, waiting for the moment when its voice would be needed most. Thomas stood at the port rail, watching the horizon darken, while Goliath sat beside him, with the patient stillness of a creature that had weathered many storms. The dog's amber eyes tracked the movement of clouds with an intensity that made Thomas uneasy. There was something in Goliath's posture, tension that spoke of knowledge beyond instinct. "Storm coming," First Mate Rodriguez announced to Captain Blackwood, though both men had read the signs hours ago. Rodriguez had learned to trust his bones more than any barometer, and they ached with the promise of violence. The crew began their preparations with the practiced efficiency of men who had danced with death in a dozen different forms. Sails were secured, loose cargo lashed down, and the cannons double-checked in their restraints. Thomas found himself assigned to the lower decks, helping to secure the water barrels alongside old Ezra Pemberton and Billy Bones. "First real blow since you came aboard, lad," Ezra said, his weathered hands working a rope with automatic precision. The old cook had survived more storms than he cared to count, and his calm in the face of approaching chaos was legendary. "The sea's got a way of testing new souls, she does." Above them the wind began to howl through the rigging like a living thing in pain. The Serpent's Revenge rolled heavily to starboard, then back to port as the first real waves began to strike her hull. Thomas felt his stomach lurch, but Goliath remained steady beside him, the dog's massive frame adjusting to each movement of the ship with natural grace. Then the storm truly arrived. The rain came first in fat droplets that struck the deck like musket balls, followed by sheets of water that turned the air itself into a grey wall. Lightning split the sky with brilliant forks that illuminated the chaos, for brief, terrifying moments before plunging everything back into darkness. Thunder crashed overhead with such force that it seemed to shake the very bones of the ship. "All hands on deck," Captain Blackwood's voice cut through the storm's roar, and Thomas scrambled up the companionway with Goliath close behind. The scene above was one of controlled chaos as men fought to keep the ship from being torn apart by wind and wave. The mainmast creaked ominously under the strain, its stays singing a high, dangerous note that spoke of imminent failure. Waves crashed over the bow, sending cascades of seawater across the deck that made footing treacherous. In the dim light of the storm lanterns, Thomas could see his crewmates struggling with lines and tackle, their faces set with grim determination. It was then that disaster struck her. A massive wave, larger than any that had come before, rose up on the starboard side like a green wall of death. It crashed down with tremendous force, sweeping across the deck and carrying young Billy Bones toward the rail. The boy's scream was lost in the storm's fury as he slid across the slick planking, his hands scrabbling for any hold that might save him from the hungry sea. Thomas started toward him, but Goliath was faster. The great dog launched himself across the deck with surprising speed, his powerful legs finding purchase where men slipped and fell. He reached Billy just as the boy's legs went over the rail, catching the fabric of his shirt in jaws that could have crushed bone but held with the gentleness of a mother carrying her pup. For a moment that seemed to last forever, dog and boy hung suspended over the churning water while the ship rolled beneath them. Then, with strength that defied belief, Goliath hauled backward, dragging Billy back onto the deck and safety. The bronze bell began to toll, its deep voice cutting through the storm as Captain Blackwood himself rang it in recognition of what they had all witnessed. Here was no ordinary dog, but a creature whose courage matched that of any man aboard. But the storm was far from finished with them. The wind shifted suddenly, catching the foresail and threatening to snap the mast. Thomas found himself hauling on a line alongside Gunner Mackenzie, his muscles burning with the effort. Beside him, Goliath braced his powerful frame against a stanchion, somehow sensing that his presence provided comfort to the men fighting for their lives. "Cut the sail loose," Rodriguez shouted over the wind. "She'll tear the mast clean away." Thomas pulled his knife and sword at the heavy rope, his hands numb with cold and fear. The line parted just as another wave crashed over them, and the remnants of the sail disappeared into the darkness like a ghost fleeing the dawn. For 6 hours they battled the storm, each man pushed to the limit of endurance. But when the first pale light of morning finally broke through the clouds, the Serpent's Revenge still rode the waves, battered but unbroken. And standing at Thomas's side, his coat matted with seawater, but his eyes bright with satisfaction, was the dog who had saved a life and earned his place among them. The storm had tested them all, but it had also revealed something extraordinary. In choosing Goliath, Thomas had gained more than a companion. He had found a guardian whose loyalty would prove stronger than any storm the sea could conjure. The tattered pirate flag that flew from the mainmast of the Serpent's Revenge had seen better days. Its black skull and crossed cutlasses were faded from sun and salt spray, but it still proclaimed their allegiance to the Brotherhood of the Sea. As the ship limped toward a small, unmarked island to make repairs from the storm damage, Thomas found himself studying that flag and thinking about what it meant to belong somewhere. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and the crew's attitude toward Goliath had undergone a subtle but unmistakable shift. The dog had established routines that seemed to benefit everyone aboard. Each morning he would make a circuit of the ship, his keen nose detecting problems that human senses might miss. Twice he had alerted them to loose rigging before it could snap under strain. Once his urgent barking had drawn attention to a small fire in the galley that could have consumed the ship. "It's uncanny," Gunner Mackenzie confided to Thomas as they worked together splicing rope. The Scotsman's weathered hands moved with practiced skill, but his eyes kept drifting to where Goliath lay in the shade of the mizzen sail. "That beast of yours knows things before they happen." Thomas had begun to notice it too. Goliath possessed an awareness that went beyond normal animal instinct. The dog could sense weather changes hours before the sky showed any sign, would grow restless when hostile ships lurked beyond the horizon, and somehow always knew which barrel held the freshest water when supplies ran low. The island they approached was little more than a crescent of white sand and palm trees, but it boasted a freshwater spring and a protected cove, perfect for careening the ship. Captain Blackwood had used this refuge before, and he trusted its isolation from both naval patrols and rival pirates. As the crew prepared to beach the ship for hull repairs, Goliath suddenly stood rigid at the bow, his ears forward and his body tense with alertness. Thomas moved to his side, following the dog's intense gaze toward the tree line. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked quietly, his hand resting on Goliath's massive head. The dog whined softly, a sound Thomas had learned meant uncertainty rather than fear. There was something on the island, but Goliath seemed unable to decide whether it represented danger or opportunity. "Fresh water," announced Ezra Pemberton after wading ashore with an empty cask. The old cook had filled it at a crystal-clear stream that bubbled up from underground springs. "Sweet as any I've tasted." But it was Goliath who led them to the real treasure. The dog bounded into the island's interior, following scents invisible to human noses, until he stopped beside a grove of fruit trees heavy with mangoes and coconuts. More importantly, he had discovered a small herd of wild goats, whose meat would supplement their dwindling provisions perfectly. "How did he know?" Billy Bones asked in wonder, as they returned to the beach with fresh fruit and the promise of meat for dinner. Thomas could only shake his head. There was something about Goliath's abilities that defied easy explanation, as if the dog possessed knowledge accumulated over years of experience that no ordinary animal could claim. It was during their third day on the island that Scarface Pete made his move. The repairs were nearly complete, and the crew had relaxed into the easy rhythm of shore leave. Thomas was teaching Goliath to retrieve coconuts from the tall palms when Pete approached with his usual sneer. "Still playing with your pet?" Well, Pete's scarred face twisted with malicious amusement. Crew starting to whisper, "You know, say you've got unnatural influence over that beast." Thomas straightened slowly, recognizing the dangerous edge in Pete's voice. Over the months since joining the crew, he had learned to read the warning signs that preceded the older pirate's cruelty. "Just training him to be useful." Thomas replied carefully. "Useful?" Pete laughed harshly. "That monster eats enough for 3 men and takes up space we need for cargo. Captain's been too soft on you, boy, but that won't last forever." Goliath had gone very still, his amber eyes fixed on Pete with an intensity that made the scarred pirate unconsciously step backward. The dog was not growling, but something in his posture radiated a quiet menace that spoke of barely restrained power. "Call off your hound," Pete snarled, his hand moving toward the cutlass at his side. "He's not doing anything," Thomas observed truthfully. Goliath had not moved from his position, but his presence had somehow filled the space between them like a tangible force. Pete's eyes darted nervously between boy and dog, clearly wanting to press his advantage, but unwilling to risk an open confrontation with an animal whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. With a final curse, he stalked away, leaving Thomas alone with his companion. That evening, as the crew gathered around a driftwood fire to share roasted goat and fresh fruit, Captain Blackwood approached Thomas with unusual formality. "Walk with me, lad," Captain said quietly. They strolled along the moonlit beach, while Goliath ranged ahead of them, investigating the scents that washed ashore with each wave. The dog's movements were graceful despite his size, and Thomas noticed how he automatically positioned himself to guard their flanks. "There's something different about that dog of yours," Blackwood said after a long silence. "The men see it, and they're starting to talk." Thomas felt his heart sink. "Are you ordering me to get rid of him, Captain?" Blackwood stopped walking and turned to study Thomas with eyes that missed nothing. "Quite the opposite, actually. I'm making him official, ship's mascot, with all the rights and privileges thereof. Any man who harms him answers to me personally." The relief that flooded through Thomas was almost overwhelming. "Thank you, Captain." "Don't thank me yet," Blackwood warned. "There are still questions about where he came from, how he knows what he knows. Those scars weren't made by accident, and that collar he wears was crafted by skilled hands. Someone trained him well, and someday they might come looking for him." The jeweled dagger at Scarface Pete's belt caught the morning sun as he sharpened it with slow, deliberate strokes. The weapon was his most prized possession, its curved blade inscribed with Spanish words that spoke of honor and revenge. He had taken it from a naval officer during a boarding action 3 years past, and it had served him well in the dark work that others preferred to avoid. Pete's hatred of Thomas Hartwell had grown like a cancer over the weeks since the storm. It gnawed at him to see the young whelp gaining respect among the crew, to watch men who had once barely noticed the boy now seeking his opinion on matters both great and small. Worse still was the growing influence of that cursed dog, whose uncanny abilities made even the most skeptical sailors whisper about luck and providence. The opportunity Pete had been waiting for came on a sweltering afternoon as the Serpent's Revenge sailed the shipping lanes between Jamaica and the Spanish Main. Thomas had been assigned to the crow's nest for lookout duty, leaving Goliath alone on the main deck where he lay panting in whatever shade he could find. Pete had prepared carefully. The rope he had weakened would look like normal wear when it snapped under the strain of a sudden wind shift. The heavy block and tackle it supported would come crashing down precisely where Thomas stood each evening to groom his companion. It would appear to be nothing more than a tragic accident, the kind of mishap that claims sailors' lives with depressing regularity. But Goliath seemed to sense the trap. As Pete made his final adjustments to the sabotaged rigging, the great dog rose from his resting place and approached with the silent grace of a hunting wolf, his amber eyes fixed on Pete with an intelligence that made the scarred pirate's skin crawl. There was something in that gaze that suggested the dog understood exactly what was happening, and more disturbingly, exactly who Pete was. "Get away from me, you devil," Pete muttered, trying to maintain his casual demeanor while his hands trembled with sudden fear. Goliath sat down directly beneath the weakened rope, his massive form positioned precisely where the falling tackle would strike. He made no sound, but his presence was like a physical weight, pressing down on Pete's conscience. The dog's message was clear. If the trap were to be sprung, he would be its first victim. From high above, Thomas called down a sighting of distant sails, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held Pete frozen, and he stumbled away from the rigging with his sabotage incomplete. Behind him, Goliath remained motionless, a four-legged guardian standing watch over dangers only he could fully perceive. That evening, as Thomas descended from his lookout post, Pete tried a different approach. He had been drinking rum to steady his nerves, and the alcohol made him bold in ways that sobriety would have counseled against. "Your beast's got you fooled, boy," Pete said, his words slightly slurred as he intercepted Thomas near the ship's rail. "Thinks he's some kind of guardian angel, does he? Well, I knew his previous master, and I can tell you true, that dog's got blood on his paws." Thomas paused in coiling the rope he carried, his attention fully focused on Pete for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Pete's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. "Admiral Morrison. That's who owned him before. Royal Navy. Through and through. Used that beast to hunt down pirates like us. He did. Trained him to track men through jungles and swamps, to kill on command when cornered prey turned to fight." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had wondered about Goliath's scars, about the military precision of his movements, but he had never imagined this. "You're lying." "Am I?" Pete pulled a folded piece of newspaper from his pocket, its edges yellowed with age. The headline spoke of a naval engagement off the coast of Hispaniola, where Admiral Morrison's flagship had been lost with all hands during a hurricane. The article mentioned the Admiral's famous war dog, presumed drowned when the ship went down. "Found that in Port Royal," Pete continued, enjoying the shock on Thomas's face. "Seems your precious Goliath is supposed to be dead, along with his master. Makes a man wonder how he ended up in that merchant's cage, doesn't it?" Thomas looked down at the newspaper, then across the deck to where Goliath lay sleeping in the shade of the mainmast. The dog's peaceful expression gave no hint of the violence Pete described, but the evidence was difficult to ignore. "Even if it's true," Thomas said slowly, "it doesn't matter. He's not that dog anymore." Pete laughed harshly. "A killer's always a killer, boy. Training like that doesn't just disappear because you feed him scraps and scratch behind his ears. Someday, when the mood takes him, he'll remember what he was made for. And when that happens, you'll be the first to discover just how sharp those teeth really are." As if sensing the conversation, Goliath raised his great head and looked directly at them. His amber eyes held depth that spoke of experiences no ordinary animal could claim, of loyalty tested by fire, and choices that had cost him everything. Whatever he had been in his previous life, Thomas realized the dog he was now had been forged by loss and shaped by the kind of betrayal that left scars deeper than any blade could carve. The jeweled dagger at Pete's belt seemed to pulse with malevolent light as he watched Thomas struggle with this new knowledge. He had planted the seed of doubt, and now all that remained was to wait for it to grow into the kind of fear that would drive a wedge between boy and dog forever. But Pete had underestimated both the strength of the bond he sought to destroy and the depth of loyalty that could exist between two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. The letter bearing Admiral Morrison's official seal arrived with the dawn, carried by a lone naval cutter that had approached under a flag of truce. Captain Blackwood read it twice before summoning his officers to his cabin, his weathered face grave with the implications of what he held in his hands. "Gentlemen," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years at sea, "it seems we have attracted some unwanted attention." First Mate Rodriguez took the parchment with careful hands, his eyes scanning the formal language that barely concealed the threat beneath. The commission letter was signed by Admiral Sir Edmund Morrison, Knight Commander of the Bath, and it spoke of pursuit, capture, and justice with the cold precision of official orders. "He's mobilized 3 ships of the line," Rodriguez said quietly. "The Intrepid, the Valiant, and his flagship, the Retribution, 44 guns each, with full complements of Marines." Gunner Mackenzie whistled low under his breath. "That's enough firepower to level Port Royal." "What does he want with us that bad?" The answer lay not in what they had stolen, but in what they had rescued. Morrison's letter made it clear that his pursuit was personal, driven by the loss of something far more valuable to him than any cargo they might have taken. The Admiral wanted his dog back, and he was prepared to risk everything to reclaim what he considered his property. "There's more," Blackwood continued, producing a second document from his desk. This one was older, its edges worn from handling, and it bore the signature of Morrison himself from 3 years past. It was a report of the hurricane that had claimed the Admiral's previous flagship, detailing the loss of crew, equipment, and one specially trained war dog presumed drowned in the disaster. Thomas, who had been summoned to the captain's cabin along with the senior officers, felt his world shifting beneath his feet like a ship in heavy seas. The newspaper clipping Pete had shown him was real, and now he faced the terrible truth that Goliath's past was about to collide with their present in the most dangerous possible way. "The dog survived," Blackwood said, his eyes finding Thomas across the cabin. "Somehow he made it to shore and eventually ended up in that merchant's cargo hold. But Morrison has never stopped looking for him." The implications were staggering. Thomas had always wondered about Goliath's exceptional abilities, his uncanny knowledge of naval procedures, his almost supernatural awareness of danger. Now those mysteries resolved themselves into a pattern that spoke of years of specialized training under one of the Royal Navy's most ruthless commanders. "What kind of training are we talking about?" Rodriguez asked, though his expression suggested he already feared the answer. Blackwood consulted the Admiral's letter again. Morrison's report describes a program designed to create the perfect naval war dog, tracking attack commands, ship-to-ship combat, even basic navigation skill. The animal was taught to identify enemy vessels by sight, to locate hidden compartments during searches, and to serve as a living weapon when conventional tactics failed. Thomas thought of Goliath's gentle nature, his protective instincts toward the crew, his obvious intelligence and loyalty. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the description of a trained killer, yet he could not deny the evidence of his own observation. The dog's scars, his knowledge of naval procedures, his almost human understanding of complex situations, all pointed to a past far more complicated than Thomas had imagined. "There's something else," Blackwood continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Morrison's letter suggests that the dog was more than just a weapon to him. Personal correspondence indicates that Goliath was his constant companion, his most trusted ally in campaigns spanning the breadth of the Caribbean. The admiral's wife died years ago, his only son was killed in action, and by all accounts that dog became the closest thing to family he had left. The cabin fell silent as the full weight of their situation became clear. They were not simply being hunted by a naval officer seeking to recover stolen property. They faced a man driven by grief and loss, whose pursuit was motivated by the kind of desperate love that could drive even reasonable men to madness. "He'll never stop," Thomas said quietly, his hand unconsciously moving to the brass compass at his throat. "Not until he gets Goliath back, or until we're all dead." Rodriguez added grimly, "Morrison's reputation is built on the idea that he never accepts defeat. If he's committed 3 ships of the line to this pursuit, he means to see it through to the end." Outside the cabin, they could hear Goliath's familiar bark as he played with Billy Bones on the main deck. The sound that had become such a comforting part of their daily routine now carried undertones of impending doom. The dog who had saved their lives, who had become their mascot and protector, was also the key to their destruction. Captain Blackwood folded the commission letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man who had faced impossible odds before and lived to tell the tale. "We have perhaps 2 days before Morrison's fleet reaches these waters," he announced. "That gives us time to prepare, time to decide how we want to face what's coming. But make no mistake, gentlemen, this ends only one way. Either we find a way to outfight or outsmart one of the Royal Navy's most decorated admirals, or the Serpent's revenge becomes another footnote in his distinguished career." The weight of destiny settled over them like a heavy cloak, as each man contemplated what lay ahead. They had faced storms and battles before, but never anything like this. Never a pursuit driven by love and loss, where surrender meant not just imprisonment, but the breaking of bonds that had become more precious than life itself. The ship's logbook lay open on Captain Blackwood's desk, its pages filled with decades of careful observations, tactical notes, and hard-won wisdom. Every entry told a story of survival against impossible odds, but none had prepared them for the challenge they now faced. The approaching naval fleet, commanded by Admiral Morrison, represented not just superior firepower, but a lifetime of strategic brilliance, honed in countless battles across the 7 seas. Thomas knelt beside Goliath in the captain's cabin, his hands moving through the great dog's thick fur as he studied the animal with new eyes. Every scar told a story of service and sacrifice. Every movement revealed training so ingrained it had become instinct. The revelation of Goliath's past had changed everything, yet somehow nothing at all. The dog's loyalty to Thomas remained absolute, his protective instincts toward the crew unchanged. "Show me," Thomas said quietly, remembering fragments of naval commands he had heard in ports throughout the Caribbean. At the word "attention," Goliath immediately sat at perfect military posture, his amber eyes fixed forward with the discipline of a seasoned soldier. Search sent him padding around the cabin, his nose working methodically to examine every corner with professional thoroughness. Most remarkably, at the command formation, the dog moved to Thomas's left side and slightly behind, the exact position a war dog would take when accompanying officers into battle. Captain Blackwood watched these demonstrations with growing understanding. "He remembers it all," the captain observed. "Years of training, ingrained so deeply that it's become part of his nature. But he chooses us," Thomas replied firmly. "Whatever he was before, whatever Morrison meant to him, he's chosen to stay with us." First Mate Rodriguez spread charts across the cabin table, his weathered finger tracing possible escape routes through the maze of islands and reefs that dotted the Caribbean. "Morrison knows these waters as well as we do," he said grimly. "He's been hunting pirates in them for 20 years. The tactical situation was dire. Morrison's 3 ships of the line could deliver coordinated broadsides that would reduce the Serpent's revenge to driftwood in minutes. Their only advantages lay in speed, maneuverability, and intimate knowledge of waters too shallow for larger vessels to navigate safely. "There," Gunner Mackenzie said, pointing to a cluster of small islands marked on the chart. Devil's Triangle, coral reefs that'll gut any ship drawing more than 12 feet of water. It was a desperate gambit that would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. The plan called for leading Morrison's fleet into the treacherous waters, where their superior firepower would become a liability rather than an advantage. But success would depend on factors beyond their control, including wind, tide, and the tactical decisions of an admiral whose brilliance was legendary throughout the Royal Navy. As preparations began, Thomas found himself torn between hope and despair. Part of him wanted to believe they could outwit Morrison's pursuit, but another part whispered that they were only delaying the inevitable. The Admiral's letter had made clear that this was personal, driven by a grief that would not accept compromise or negotiation. That evening, as the crew worked to prepare the ship for what might be their final battle, Thomas sat with Goliath on the foredeck and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The dog pressed against his side with familiar warmth, offering comfort that transcended words or understanding. "I could let you go," Thomas said quietly. "Swim to shore when Morrison's ships appear. Return to your old master and save us all from this pursuit." Goliath looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Thomas could have sworn he saw understanding there. The dog knew what was being offered, knew that his presence endangered everyone aboard the Serpent's Revenge. Yet when Thomas gestured toward the distant shoreline, Goliath simply laid his great head on Thomas's lap and refused to move. The choice had been made, as clear and final as any decision rendered by human wisdom. Goliath would not abandon the family he had found among these pirates, would not return to a past that, however meaningful, could not compete with the bonds forged in storm and battle. Captain Blackwood joined them. As full darkness fell, his presence a comfort in the growing tension that gripped the ship. "The men are ready," he reported quietly. "Mackenzie's loaded the cannons with chain shot for the rigging. Rodriguez has prepared the emergency sails in case our main canvas gets shot away. Even old Ezra has sharpened his carving knives, in case we're boarded." "And Pete?" Thomas asked, knowing that Scarface Pete's loyalties were always questionable in moments of crisis. "Pete will fight," Blackwood said with certainty. "Whatever his feelings about you and your dog, he knows that capture means the gallows for all of us. Personal grievances become secondary when facing a common enemy." In the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, 3 sets of running lights appeared on the horizon. Morrison's fleet had found them at last, and the final confrontation could no longer be avoided. The admiral who had trained Goliath, who had loved him as the last connection to a family destroyed by war, was coming to reclaim what he considered his own. As the crew took their positions for the battle to come, Thomas felt the weight of his father's compass pressing against his chest. The instrument that had guided merchant ships through safe waters now pointed toward a conflict that would determine not just their survival, but the very nature of loyalty itself. In a few hours they would discover whether the bonds forged by choice could prove stronger than those imposed by duty and training. Admiral Morrison's ceremonial sword gleamed in the dawn light as he stood on the quarterdeck of the Retribution, his weathered hands gripping the rail with barely controlled tension. The blade had been presented to him by King George himself after the victory at Antigua, its gold-inlaid hilt bearing the royal cipher and his family motto, "Duty above all." For 30 years that sword had been his symbol of authority, his reminder of the oaths that bound him to crown and country. The 3 ships of his fleet moved in perfect formation through the crystal-clear waters of the Caribbean, their gun ports open and crews at battle stations. The Intrepid and Valiant flanked his flagship like hunting hounds, their captains awaiting his signal to close the trap that would finally end this long pursuit. "Signal from the masthead, Admiral," reported Captain Henley, his flag lieutenant, Serpent's Revenge, bearing northeast, making for the Devil's Triangle. Morrison nodded grimly. Blackwood was running for the shallow waters where larger ships feared to tread. Exactly as he had expected, the pirate captain was skilled and experienced, but his tactics were predictable to a man who had spent decades hunting his kind through every reef and inlet in the Caribbean. "He thinks to lose us in the shallows," Morrison murmured, his pale blue eyes fixed on the distant pirate vessel. "But he forgets that I know these waters better than any man alive. Through his telescope, Morrison could see figures moving on the Serpent's Revenge, and his heart clenched with desperate hope. Somewhere aboard that ship was the only living creature that mattered to him, the faithful companion he had mourned for 3 long years. Goliath had been more than just a war dog. He had been family, the last connection to a world that had been systematically destroyed by war, disease, and the cruel passage of time. The Admiral's wife, Catherine, had died of fever while he was campaigning in the Indies. His son, James, had fallen at Trafalgar, cut down by French grapeshot while serving as a midshipman aboard the Victory. One by one, everything he had loved had been taken from him, until only Goliath remained. The dog had shared his cabin, slept beside his bunk, accompanied him on every mission, with the unwavering loyalty that had become legendary throughout the fleet. When the hurricane had claimed his previous flagship, Morrison had been ashore coordinating with colonial authorities. He had watched from the harbor as winds beyond imagination had driven the ship onto the rocks, breaking her apart like kindling before his helpless eyes. The official reports had listed Goliath among the casualties, but Morrison had never stopped hoping, never stopped searching every port and market for word of his beloved companion. "Bring us to within cannon range," Morrison ordered, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Signal the Intrepid to take position off their starboard quarter. The Valiant will close from port. When they're trapped, we'll demand their surrender." But as the naval vessels began their approach, the Serpent's Revenge did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing deeper into the treacherous waters, Blackwood's ship suddenly came about, presenting her broadside to the approaching fleet with the defiant gesture of a cornered wolf. The first salvo from the pirate ship caught the Retribution's crew by surprise, chain shot shrieking through the rigging and sending canvas and rope raining down on the deck. Morrison felt grudging admiration for Blackwood's audacity, even as he recognized the futility of the gesture. One pirate vessel against 3 ships of the line was courage verging on madness. "Return fire," Morrison commanded, but even as his gun crews leaped to their stations, he found himself hoping that the coming battle would not claim the life he had come so far to save. The thunder of cannon filled the morning air as both fleets engaged, smoke billowing across the water like fog. The Serpent's Revenge danced between the larger vessels with desperate agility, her crew displaying seamanship that would have been admirable under different circumstances. But Morrison's ships were closing the range methodically, their superior firepower beginning to tell as shot after shot found its mark. It was then that Morrison saw him. Standing at the bow of the pirate ship, unmistakable even at this distance, was a massive dog whose coat caught the morning sun like burnished copper. Goliath was alive, whole, and apparently unharmed after 3 years of separation. The sight hit Morrison like a physical blow, confirming his wildest hopes, while simultaneously breaking his heart. The dog was not alone. Beside him stood a young man, barely more than a boy, whose hand rested protectively on Goliath's head. Even from this distance, Morrison could see the bond between them, could recognize the kind of devotion he had once shared with his lost companion. "Cease fire!" Morrison shouted suddenly, his voice cutting through the thunder of battle. "All ships, cease fire immediately." The guns fell silent with startling abruptness, leaving only the sound of wind and wave to fill the sudden stillness. Morrison's officers stared at him in confusion, unable to understand why their admiral would halt an engagement when victory was within their grasp. But Morrison's attention was fixed entirely on the pirate ship, where Goliath stood like a statue carved from living stone. The dog's head was raised, his ears forward, as if he too had recognized something familiar in the chaos of battle. For a moment that seemed to last forever, man and dog regarded each other across the water that separated them, each remembering what they had once meant to each other. Then Goliath did something that stopped Morrison's heart. The great dog turned away from the naval fleet and pressed closer to the young pirate at his side, his choice as clear and final as any declaration of war. In the quiet hours that followed the battle, As smoke cleared from the water and both fleets assessed their damage, Thomas sat in his hammock and carved. His knife moved with practiced strokes through a piece of driftwood he had saved from their time on the island, slowly revealing the figure that had lived in his imagination for weeks. Goliath emerged from the wood as if he had always been there, waiting to be discovered, his noble head held high and his amber eyes seeming to look toward some distant horizon. The wooden carving would never capture the true essence of the great dog, could never replicate the warmth of his fur or the intelligence that shone in his gaze. But it would serve as a testament to something far more precious than artistic skill. It would be a record of loyalty freely given, of bonds forged not by training or command, but by the simple recognition of kindred spirits finding each other in an uncertain world. Admiral Morrison had withdrawn his fleet after that moment of recognition, his ships retreating just beyond cannon range, while he contemplated what he had witnessed. The message that arrived under flag of truce an hour later was brief and to the point. The Admiral requested a parley to discuss terms that might satisfy honor on both sides. Captain Blackwood had accepted, though not without reservation. The meeting would take place on neutral ground, a small uninhabited island that lay midway between the two fleets. Both commanders would be permitted a small escort, but the negotiations would be conducted with the understanding that treachery from either side would result in immediate and devastating retaliation. Thomas had been surprised to learn that Blackwood intended to bring him to the parley. "Why me, Captain?" he had asked, genuinely puzzled by the decision. "Because this isn't about tactics or treasure anymore," Blackwood had replied. "It's about that dog of yours, and the choice he's made. Morrison needs to hear it from you, needs to understand what Goliath means to this crew, and what we mean to him." Now, as Thomas put the finishing touches on his carving, he tried to prepare himself for what would surely be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. How did one explain to a grieving man that the companion he had loved and lost had found a new family? How could words convey the depth of loyalty that had grown between boy and dog over months of shared danger and mutual dependence? Goliath lay beside the hammock, his great head resting on his paws as he watched Thomas work. The dog seemed to understand that something momentous was approaching, that decisions would soon be made that would affect them all. His amber eyes held a calmness that Thomas envied, the peace of a creature who had already chosen his path and would not be swayed by arguments or appeals to his past. "You know what he's going to ask, don't you?" Thomas said quietly, pausing in his carving to scratch behind Goliath's ears. "He's going to want you to come back with him, to return to the life you had before." The dog's only response was to press closer to Thomas's side, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it needed no translation. Whatever Goliath had been in his previous life, whatever loyalty he had once given to Admiral Morrison, his heart now belonged entirely to the young pirate who had chosen him when everyone else laughed. The boat that would carry them to the parley had been prepared, its small crew selected from among the most trusted men aboard the Serpent's Revenge. First Mate Rodriguez would accompany them, along with Gunner Mackenzie and, surprisingly, Scarface Pete. The inclusion of Pete had been Thomas's suggestion, born of a growing understanding that their antagonist's hatred might actually serve a useful purpose in the coming negotiations. "Are you ready, lad?" Captain Blackwood asked, as they prepared to lower the boat. Thomas looked down at the wooden carving in his hands, then at Goliath, who waited patiently for whatever was to come. The dog's presence was a source of strength, a reminder that some bonds transcended the circumstances of their creation. "As ready as I'll ever be," Thomas replied, tucking the carving into his shirt pocket where it rested next to his father's compass. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as their boat pulled away from the Serpent's Revenge, carrying them toward a confrontation that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the very nature of loyalty itself. Behind them, the crew of the pirate ship watched from the rails, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and resignation. Ahead lay the Admiral who had trained Goliath, who had loved him as family, and who now faced the terrible reality that love alone might not be enough to reclaim what had been lost. The meeting would test everything Thomas believed about choice and loyalty, about the bonds that tie one soul to another, and about the courage required to let go of the past in order to embrace an uncertain future. As their boat cut through the crystal-clear waters of the Caribbean, Thomas felt the wooden carving of Goliath pressing against his chest, a tangible reminder of the love that had transformed a simple deckhand into something far more important. A friend, a protector, and a keeper of loyalties that would endure long after the last cannon had fallen silent. The sun was setting over the neutral island when Admiral Morrison stepped onto the beach, his ceremonial sword at his side gleaming in the fading light. He had aged in the 3 years since Goliath's presumed death, silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much loss. Behind him walked Captain Henley and 2 Marine sergeants, their uniforms immaculate. Despite the day's battle, Thomas felt his heart hammering as their boat scraped against the sandy shore almost simultaneously. This was the moment everything had been leading to, the confrontation between past and present that would determine Goliath's future. The great dog stood beside him with perfect composure, but Thomas could feel the tension in the animal's massive frame. Captain Blackwood stepped forward first, extending the courtesy due to Morrison's rank, despite their opposing positions. "Admiral, I thank you for agreeing to this parley." Morrison's pale blue eyes swept over the pirate crew before settling on Thomas and Goliath. For a long moment, man and dog regarded each other across the small stretch of sand, years of shared history visible in that silent exchange. "My God," Morrison whispered, his composed facade cracking slightly. "He's real. He's actually alive." Goliath's ears pricked forward at the familiar voice, and Thomas felt the dog's muscles tense beneath his hand. There was recognition there, unmistakable and profound, but no movement toward his former master. The dog remained firmly at Thomas's side, his amber eyes watchful, but not hostile. "You trained him well, Admiral," Blackwood observed. "He's saved our lives more times than I can count." "I trained him to serve," Morrison replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "To protect his crew, to be loyal unto death." It seems those lessons took root. The Admiral approached slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. Thomas could see the pain in the older man's eyes, the desperate hope warring with the growing realization that his beloved companion had found a new family. "Hello, old friend," Morrison said softly, extending his hand toward Goliath. The dog's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He rose to his feet and took a single step forward, his tail beginning to wag with the remembered joy of seeing his first master. For a moment, Thomas thought he was about to lose his companion, that the bonds of years of shared service would prove stronger than months of newer loyalty. Then Goliath stopped, his amber eyes shifting between Morrison and Thomas. The internal struggle was visible in every line of his powerful frame. Here was the man who had raised him, trained him, loved him, as family. But there was also the young pirate who had chosen him when others laughed, who had accepted him without question or condition. Morrison saw the hesitation and his shoulders sagged slightly. "You've made your choice, haven't you, boy?" "Admiral," Thomas said quietly, finding his voice at last. "I want you to know that I understand what he meant to you, what he still means to you." Morrison's gaze shifted to Thomas, studying the young man with the calculating look of someone accustomed to judging character, quickly and accurately. "You're the one who chose him. When the others went for the parrots and monkeys, you saw something in him they missed." "I saw a creature who deserved kindness," Thomas replied simply, "who deserved a chance to be more than just a weapon or a tool. And what has he become under your care?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "A friend, a protector, part of our family." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Goliath's face. The dog had settled back beside Thomas, his choice made clear by his position, though his attention remained fixed on his former master. "I could order you to return him," Morrison said finally. "I have the legal right and the firepower to enforce it." "You could," Blackwood agreed, "but you won't." "What makes you so certain?" It was Scarface Pete who answered, speaking for the first time since they had landed. "Because you're not the kind of man who forces loyalty, Admiral. That dog there, he's chosen his path. Forcing him back to yours would destroy everything you loved about him in the first place." Morrison turned to study Pete with surprise, not expecting wisdom from such a source. "You speak as if you know me." "I know your reputation," Pete replied. "Fair to prisoners, honest in your dealings, never broke a truce or betrayed a parley. You're an honorable man in a dishonorable profession. Just like we are, in our own way." The Admiral's laugh was short and bitter. "Pirates with honor. The world has become a strange place indeed." "The world's always been strange," Thomas said. "It just takes time to see the patterns." He pulled the wooden carving from his pocket, the figure of Goliath he had completed just hours before. The craftsmanship was simple but heartfelt, capturing something essential about the great dog's noble bearing. "I made this," Thomas said, offering the carving to Morrison. "I thought you might want to have it. A reminder of what you meant to each other." Morrison took the wooden figure with hands that trembled slightly. His fingers traced the carved features, and for a moment his composed facade cracked entirely, revealing the grief he had carried for 3 long years. "Keep him safe," the Admiral said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's the last good thing I have left in this world, even if he's no longer mine." The parley had reached its conclusion as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. But Admiral Morrison made one final request that surprised everyone present. He asked to speak with Goliath alone, just for a moment, to say the farewell he had never been able to offer when he believed his companion had drowned with his ship. Thomas felt a stab of anxiety as he watched Morrison approach the great dog, wondering if this private moment might somehow change Goliath's decision. But Blackwood placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and nodded toward where the Admiral knelt in the sand. Morrison's voice was too quiet for the others to hear, but his posture spoke of a man unburdening his heart of 3 years of grief and regret. He spoke of the battles they had shared, the quiet evenings in his cabin when the dog had been his only companion, the pride he had felt watching Goliath master each new skill and challenge. Goliath listened with the patience of a creature who understood that this moment was important, beyond measure. When Morrison finished speaking, the dog stepped forward and rested his great head against the Admiral's chest, offering comfort to the man who had once been his world. It was a gesture of forgiveness and farewell that brought tears to even the hardest eyes among the watching pirates and marines. Here was loyalty acknowledged and honored, even as it passed from one form to another. The bond between Morrison and Goliath would always exist, but it had transformed into something that could survive separation. "Thank you," Morrison whispered, his hand stroking the familiar fur one last time. "Thank you for choosing someone worthy of your devotion." When the Admiral rose and returned to his men, his face had regained its composed dignity, though his eyes remained bright with unshed tears. The wooden carving of Goliath remained clutched in his hand, and Thomas knew it would travel with the Admiral for whatever years remained to him. "This matter is concluded," Morrison announced formally. "The Serpent's Revenge and her crew may depart these waters unmolested. Consider your past transgressions forgiven in light of the care you have shown my former companion." Captain Blackwood inclined his head respectfully. "Your mercy does you honor, Admiral." As both parties prepared to return to their ships, Morrison approached Thomas one final time. The young pirate straightened under the Admiral's intense gaze, uncertain what final words the older man might offer. "You're very young to carry such responsibility," Morrison observed, "but I see something in you that gives me hope. You understand that true loyalty cannot be commanded or purchased. It can only be earned through consistent kindness and proven worthy through sacrifice." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle around him like a mantle. "I'll do my best by him, sir. You have my word." "I believe you will," Morrison replied. "And Thomas, remember this. The greatest honor is not in being chosen, but in proving worthy of that choice every single day thereafter." The boats pushed off from the neutral shore as full darkness fell, carrying their passengers back to ships that rode at anchor beneath a canopy of stars. The parley had ended not with surrender or conquest, but with something far rarer, mutual understanding and respect between enemies who had discovered they shared more common ground than either had imagined. Aboard the Serpent's Revenge, the crew gathered to hear Captain Blackwood's account of the negotiations. The news that they were free to sail without further pursuit was met with cheers and celebration, but Thomas found himself thinking about Morrison's final words and the responsibility they implied. Goliath seemed to sense his contemplative mood and pressed close as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the lights of Morrison's fleet fade into the distance. The great dog showed no signs of regret or second thoughts about his choice, but Thomas could see a kind of peace in those amber eyes that suggested an important chapter of his life had finally been closed. "You miss him?" Thomas said quietly. "And that's as it should be. He was good to you, wasn't he?" Goliath's soft whine confirmed what Thomas already knew. The dog's love for Morrison was real and enduring, but it had evolved into something that could coexist with his new loyalty. Love, Thomas was learning, was not a finite resource that had to be hoarded or rationed. It could expand to encompass multiple objects without diminishing in intensity or value. Rodriguez appeared at Thomas's shoulder, his weathered face showing uncharacteristic emotion. "Codden wants to see you," he announced. "Says there's something needs discussing about your future aboard this ship." As Thomas made his way toward Blackwood's cabin, Goliath padding silently beside him, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that day when he had chosen the massive dog over more conventional prizes. He had gained a companion whose loyalty was absolute, but he had also discovered strengths within himself that he had never known existed. The responsibility Morrison had spoken of was real and weighty, but Thomas found he welcomed it. Some burdens, he was learning, were actually gifts in disguise, opportunities to become the person one was meant to be. Captain Blackwood's cabin felt different as Thomas entered, the familiar space somehow charged with significance that went beyond their recent encounter with Admiral Morris. The captain sat behind his desk, but his usual charts and navigational instruments had been pushed aside to make room for official-looking documents that bore the ship's seal. "Sit down, lad," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the measured tone he reserved for moments of great importance. "We need to discuss your position aboard this ship." Thomas took the offered chair while Goliath settled beside him with the patient stillness that had become his trademark. The great dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his amber eyes alert as he watched both men with interest. "What happened today changes things," Blackwood continued. "The crew has watched you grow from a green boy into someone they respect and trust. More importantly, they've seen how you handle responsibility under the kind of pressure that breaks lesser men." The captain opened one of the documents, revealing formal language written in his careful script. "Rodriguez has served me faithfully for 15 years, but he's been talking about retirement, about finding a small plot of land somewhere warm where he can grow oranges and forget about the sea for a while." Thomas felt his heart begin to race as he realized what Blackwood was suggesting. The position of first mate was second only to the captain himself, carrying responsibilities that affected the lives and fortunes of every man aboard the Serpent's Revenge. "I'm honored by your confidence, Captain," Thomas said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for such responsibility." "No one ever is," Blackwood replied with a slight smile. "I certainly wasn't when I first took command of this ship. But readiness isn't about feeling prepared. It's about accepting the burden when circumstances demand it and growing into the role through service to others." The captain pulled out a second document, this one bearing an official seal that Thomas didn't recognize. "There's more to consider. Admiral Morrison wasn't entirely honest about his reasons for pursuing us. According to intelligence I've received from certain contacts in Port Royal, there's been talk in naval circles about offering letters of marque to selected pirate crews. Letters of marque were official documents that transformed pirates into privateers, giving them legal authority to attack enemy vessels while serving their government's interests. It was a path that had transformed many outlaws into respected captains, though it came with obligations that not all pirates were willing to accept. "The war with Spain is heating up again," Blackwood explained. "The Crown needs experienced sailors who know these waters intimately. Morrison's pursuit was partly a test, a way to evaluate our capabilities under extreme pressure." Thomas struggled to process this information. "Are you saying Morrison was working with the government to recruit us?" "Not exactly." His grief for Goliath was genuine, and his desire to reclaim his companion was real. But I suspect he also had orders to assess our worthiness for more legitimate employment. The fact that we handled ourselves with honor during the parley will weigh heavily in any future negotiations. The implications were staggering. Thomas had joined the crew of the Serpent's Revenge as a desperate young man with few options and fewer prospects. He faced the possibility of becoming first mate of a ship that might soon operate under the Crown's authority, hunting Spanish treasure galleons and protecting English merchant vessels. What does this mean for the crew? Thomas asked, thinking of men like Gunner Mackenzie and Billy Bones, whose loyalty to Blackwood was absolute, but whose feelings about serving the Crown were more complicated. It means choices, Blackwood replied. Any man who doesn't want to serve under letters of marque is free to leave with his share of our accumulated profits. Those who stay will receive regular pay, official protection, and the chance to retire with pensions instead of rope necklace. Goliath stirred beside Thomas's chair, and the young man found himself drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. The great animal had already made one life-changing choice by staying with the pirates, instead of returning to Admiral Morris. Now Thomas faced a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the futures of everyone he had come to care about. "There's something else," Blackwood said, producing a final document from his desk. "Morrison left this with his flag lieutenant before departing. It's addressed to you." Thomas took the sealed letter with hands that trembled slightly. The Admiral's precise handwriting spelled out his name on the exterior, but he hesitated to break the wax seal that would reveal Morrison's final thoughts. "Read it," Blackwood encouraged. "A man like Morrison doesn't offer words lightly." The letter was brief but profound in its implications. Morrison had written a recommendation for Thomas's character and abilities, documenting his observations of the young pirate's leadership qualities and moral integrity. More significantly, the Admiral had formally requested that any future letters of marque issued to the Serpent's Revenge include specific protections for Goliath's welfare and status as ship's mascot. "He's ensuring that bureaucracy can never separate you from your companion," Blackwood observed, as Thomas finished reading. "Even in defeat, the Admiral finds ways to protect what matters to him." Thomas folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket beside his father's compass. The two objects together represented the past and future, the foundation of who he had been and the possibility of who he might become. 3 months had passed since the encounter with Admiral Morrison, and the transformation of both Thomas and the crew of the Serpent's Revenge had been remarkable to witness. The ship now flew both the black flag of their pirate heritage and the Union Jack that marked their new status as privateers in service to the Crown. The crew had voted unanimously to accept the letters of marque, drawn not just by the promise of regular pay and protection, but by the pride that came with serving something larger than themselves. Thomas wore the brass buttons and blue coat of his new rank with quiet dignity, though the most important symbol of his authority remained the same: Goliath's unwavering presence at his side. The great dog had adapted to his master's elevated status with characteristic grace, somehow understanding that the respect shown to Thomas now extended to him as well. The crew's attitude toward both man and dog had evolved completely from those early days of ridicule and skepticism. When Thomas gave orders, they were followed without question, not because of his rank, but because of the trust he had earned through consistent fairness and genuine concern for their welfare. When Goliath alerted them to danger or opportunity, his warnings were heeded with the same respect given to any seasoned officer. Their first official mission as privateers had been to escort a merchant convoy through waters plagued by Spanish raiders. The assignment had seemed routine until Goliath's behavior alerted them to an ambush waiting among a cluster of small islands. The dog's agitation had been unmistakable, his pacing and whining providing the only warning they received before 3 Spanish galleons emerged from their hiding places. The battle that followed had showcased everything the crew had learned about working as a unified force. Thomas's tactical decisions, informed by both his own growing experience and Goliath's supernatural awareness, had allowed them to defeat a superior force through superior coordination and cunning. The Spanish ships had been captured intact, their holds filled with silver that would provide comfortable retirement funds for the entire crew. But it was the aftermath of victory that had truly demonstrated how much they had all changed. Instead of the wild celebration and casual cruelty that had once marked pirate victories, the crew of the Serpent's Revenge had treated their prisoners with the courtesy due to defeated enemies. The Spanish officers had been paroled with their personal effects intact, while the common sailors had been given the choice of joining the privateer crew or accepting passage to the nearest neutral port. Captain Blackwood had watched these developments with deep satisfaction, seeing in them the fulfillment of his long-held belief that pirates could be more than mere criminals given the right leadership and purpose. Thomas's promotion to first mate had been officially confirmed by the Admiralty, along with a personal commendation that praised his exceptional qualities of leadership and moral character under conditions of extreme adversity. The letters from London had also brought news that Admiral Morrison had been promoted to Fleet Commander. His successful identification and recruitment of the Serpent's Revenge adding significantly to his already distinguished record. More personally meaningful was the brief note Morrison had included, expressing his satisfaction at reports of Goliath's continued service and Thomas's growing reputation throughout the Caribbean. "The dog you love has chosen well," Morrison had written, "and in doing so has honored both his past and his present. I could ask for no better legacy than to know that my training contributed to the protection of good men engaged in honorable service." As Thomas stood on the quarterdeck watching his crew prepare for their next mission, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The frightened boy who had chosen a battle-scarred dog over more conventional prizes seemed like a different person, though the core values that had guided that choice remained unchanged. Goliath appeared at his side with the silent grace that never failed to amaze the crew, the great dog's presence a constant reminder of the power of loyalty freely given and faithfully maintained. The scars that marked his powerful frame had faded somewhat with good care and regular meals, but they remained visible proof of a past that had shaped him without defining his future. "New orders from Port Royal," Rodriguez announced as he approached with the morning dispatches. The former first mate had chosen to remain with the ship rather than retire, content to serve as sailing master while Thomas handled the administrative duties of his former position. Thomas broke the official seal and scanned the contents, his expression growing serious as he absorbed the implications. Their next assignment would take them deep into Spanish waters, pursuing reports of a treasure fleet that had sailed from Cartagena with enough silver to finance a war. It would be their most dangerous mission yet, requiring all the skills they had developed and more they had yet to discover. But as Thomas looked around at the crew that had become his family and felt Goliath's solid presence beside him, he knew they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The boy who had made an unlikely choice had grown into a man capable of leading others toward futures none of them had dared imagine. And the dog who had been presumed lost forever had found a new purpose that honored both his training and his heart. The Spanish treasure fleet they pursued was the largest to sail from the New World in a decade, its 5 galleons heavy with silver from the mines of Potosí and gold from the conquered kingdoms of the Aztecs. Intelligence reports suggested the fleet carried enough wealth to fund Spain's war efforts for years to come, making its interception a strategic priority for the British Crown. Thomas studied the charts spread across the table in Captain Blackwood's cabin, his finger tracing possible intercept courses through the maze of islands and reefs that characterized the Spanish Main. Beside him, Goliath lay with his great head resting on his paws, but his amber eyes remained alert, watching the men plan their most ambitious undertaking yet. "They'll be expecting pursuit," Rodriguez observed, his weathered face creased with concern. 5 galleons means at least 200 guns, plus escort vessels and enough marines to assault a fortress. Captain Blackwood nodded grimly, "which is why we won't attack them direct. Intelligence indicates they'll be making for the Windward Passage, taking advantage of the trade winds to speed their journey to Spain. But first, they have to navigate the Devil's Backbone." The Devil's Backbone was a treacherous stretch of shallow water studded with coral reefs that had claimed dozens of ships over the years. The passage through it was narrow and well-defined, making it the perfect place for a smaller, more maneuverable vessel to strike at a larger fleet's vulnerable flanks. "We'll need to coordinate with other privateers," Thomas said, thinking through the tactical requirements. "The Serpent's Revenge alone can't hope to capture 5 galleons, but we might be able to cripple them enough for a larger force to finish the job." It was then that Goliath did something unexpected. The great dog rose from his resting place and padded over to the charts, his nose working as he sniffed at the paper. For a moment, Thomas thought the dog was simply curious about the unfamiliar smells of ink and parchment. Then Goliath placed his paw directly on a small island marked near the entrance to the Devil's Backbone. The men stared in astonishment as the dog held his position, his amber eyes looking directly at Thomas as if trying to communicate something vital. There was an intensity in Goliath's posture that spoke of knowledge beyond normal animal instinct, a certainty that demanded attention. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked quietly, studying the spot where Goliath's paw rested. The island was tiny and apparently uninhabited, little more than a speck of land barely large enough to shelter a single ship. But as Thomas examined it more closely, he began to see possibilities that hadn't occurred to him before. The island sat at the perfect angle to observe traffic entering the Devil's Backbone, while its hidden coves could conceal a ship until the moment came to strike. "Admiral Morrison trained him to read charts," Thomas said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "He's not just looking at the paper, he's understanding what it represents." Captain Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "What do you think he's trying to tell us?" Thomas placed his finger on the island where Goliath's paw remained positioned. "He's suggesting an ambush point, somewhere we can wait unseen until the Spanish fleet commits to the passage, then strike at their most vulnerable moment." The tactical brilliance of the suggestion was immediately apparent to everyone in the cabin. The Spanish treasure fleet would be most vulnerable while navigating the treacherous waters of the Devil's Backbone, their attention focused on avoiding the coral reefs that could gut their ships. A single well-timed attack at that moment could cripple their lead vessels and create chaos throughout their formation. But the plan would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. They would have to remain hidden until the Spanish fleet was completely committed to the passage, trusting that their intelligence about the enemy's route and schedule was accurate. If they were wrong, or if the Spanish changed their plans, the Serpent's Revenge would find itself alone against overwhelming odds, with no possibility of retreat. "It's dangerous," Rodriguez said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Everything we do is dangerous," Blackwood replied. "The question is whether the risk is justified by the potential reward." Thomas looked down at Goliath, whose amber eyes seemed to hold depths of tactical knowledge accumulated over years of service with one of the Royal Navy's most brilliant commanders. The dog had been trained not just as a weapon, but as a partner in strategic thinking, his natural intelligence enhanced by months of exposure to naval planning and execution. "He's never been wrong before," Thomas said finally. "Every time he's tried to warn us or guide us, following his instincts has saved lives and led to success." The decision was made with the kind of quiet certainty that marked all their best choices. They would sail for the small island Goliath had identified, establish their hidden position, and wait for the Spanish treasure fleet to enter the trap. The great dog's tactical insight, inherited from his training with Admiral Morrison, would be tested on the largest stage any of them had ever faced. As they began detailed planning for what could be their most dangerous mission yet, Thomas felt a familiar weight pressing against his chest where his father's compass and Morrison's letter rested side by side. Past and future seemed to converge in this moment, bringing together everything they had learned about loyalty, courage, and the bonds that could unite the most unlikely of allies in pursuit of common purpose. The small island Goliath had identified proved even more perfect than their charts had suggested. Hidden coves provided excellent concealment for the Serpent's Revenge, while offering multiple escape routes should their plan go awry. Most importantly, the elevated position of the island's single hill provided a commanding view of the approaches to the Devil's Backbone, allowing them to observe their quarry long before being detected themselves. Thomas established his observation post among the palm trees at the island's highest point, a spyglass in one hand and Goliath pressed against his side. The great dog seemed to understand the importance of silence during these long hours of waiting, his amber eyes scanning the horizon with the same intensity as his human companions. For 3 days they waited, taking turns at the observation post while the rest of the crew prepared the ship for what would likely be the most significant action of their career. Gunner Mackenzie supervised the loading of every cannon with chain shot designed to cripple rigging rather than sink ships. Their goal was to disable the Spanish treasure fleet long enough for the other British privateers to arrive and complete the capture. On the morning of the fourth day, Goliath's sudden alertness announced the approach of their quarry long before any human eye could detect sails on the horizon. The dog's ears pricked forward and his body tensed with the anticipation that had become his signature warning of important development. "There," Thomas whispered, adjusting his spyglass to focus on the distant specks that gradually resolved into the distinctive silhouettes of Spanish galleons. 5 ships, just as intelligence predicted. The treasure fleet was magnificent in its deadly beauty, each galleon riding low in the water under the weight of precious cargo, while bristling with enough cannon to destroy any conventional opponent. The lead ship flew the Admiral's pennant, identifying it as the flagship of Don Carlos Vasquez, one of Spain's most experienced naval commanders. Thomas felt his heart begin to race as he counted the escort vessels accompanying the treasure fleet. 2 frigates and a fast sloop rode alongside the galleons, their crews undoubtedly alert for exactly the kind of ambush the Serpent's Revenge was preparing to execute. "Signal the ship," Thomas told Billy Bones, who had been assigned as his messenger. 5 galleons, 3 escorts, entering the approach exactly as predicted. Below them, the crew of the Serpent's Revenge moved into position with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to trust each other completely. Captain Blackwood took his place on the quarterdeck, his weathered hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. As the Spanish fleet drew closer, Thomas could see the elaborate decorations that marked these vessels as the pride of the Spanish treasure service. Gold leaf gleamed on their stern castles, and magnificent figureheads proclaimed the glory of the Spanish crown to any who might dare challenge their passage. But it was Goliath who provided the final piece of tactical intelligence that would make their attack possible. The great dog began moving restlessly around their observation post, his attention fixed on something beyond Thomas's ability to perceive. Then, with the deliberate precision that marked all his important communications, Goliath positioned himself to point directly at the 3rd galleon in the Spanish formation. Thomas focused his spyglass on the indicated vessel and immediately understood what the dog had detected. Unlike the other galleons, which rode deep with the weight of precious metals, this ship sat higher in the water, despite being fully loaded. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable to eyes trained in observing such details. "She's carrying something different," Thomas murmured, the implications becoming clear. "Not just silver and gold, but supplies for the Spanish garrisons, gunpowder, weapons, maybe even correspondence that could reveal Spanish military plans." The discovery changed their tactical priorities completely. While capturing any of the treasure ships would be valuable, seizing the supply vessel could provide intelligence worth more than all the silver in Peru. More importantly, its cargo of gunpowder would make it far more vulnerable to the kind of precise cannon fire the Serpent's Revenge specialized in delivering. Thomas scrambled down from the observation post with Goliath bounding ahead of him, both of them racing to share this crucial intelligence with Captain Blackwood. The Spanish fleet was now close enough that they could hear the creaking of rigging and the distant shouts of officers giving orders. "Change of target," Thomas announced as he reached the quarterdeck, quickly explaining Goliath's observation and its tactical implications. Blackwood nodded grimly, his experienced eye immediately grasping the significance of what they had discovered. "Signal Rodriguez to adjust our approach angle. We'll come in fast on the supply ship's port quarter, cripple her steering, then see if we can convince the galleon captains that discretion is the better part of valor." The plan was audacious to the point of madness, but it played to all of their strengths, while exploiting the one weakness in the Spanish formation that only Goliath's trained senses had been able to detect. As the crew made final preparations for battle, Thomas knelt beside his companion and scratched behind the great dog's ears. "Once more into the breach, old friend," he whispered, borrowing words from a play he had heard performed in Port Royal's taverns. "Let's see if Admiral Morrison's training can help us pull off the impossible one more time." The Serpent's Revenge exploded from her hiding place, like a hunting cat, pouncing on unsuspecting prey, her black hull cutting through the crystal-clear water with deadly purpose. The Spanish treasure fleet had committed fully to the narrow passage through the Devil's Backbone, their attention focused on navigating the treacherous coral reefs that could gut their ships in an instant. Thomas stood beside Captain Blackwood on the quarterdeck. Goliath pressed against his legs as the great dog watched the approaching battle with the calm intensity of a creature born for such moments. The Spanish supply galleon grew larger in their vision with each passing second, her ornate stern castle gleaming with gold leaf that would soon be blackened by cannon smoke. "Wait for it," Blackwood commanded, his weathered hands steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the Spanish escort vessels would have room to maneuver. Too late, and their target would slip through the passage to open water where superior numbers would tell. The Spanish lookouts spotted them when they were still 500 yards away, their shouts of alarm carrying clearly across the water in the morning stillness. But the treasure fleet was trapped by geography and their own formation, unable to bring their superior firepower to bear without risking collision with the coral reefs that flanked the narrow passage. "Now," Blackwood roared, and the Serpent's revenge erupted in thunder and flame. Gunner Mackenzie's careful preparations paid dividends as chain shots screamed across the water, designed not to sink the Spanish vessel but to cripple her ability to maneuver or fight back. The supply galleon's mainmast toppled with a crash that could be heard for miles, its falling rigging tangling the ship's wheel and leaving her helpless in the narrow channel. But the Spanish response was swift and professional. Don Carlos Vasquez had not earned his reputation by allowing single privateers to dictate the terms of engagement, and his flagship immediately began working to bring her guns to bear, despite the challenging tactical situation. "Hard to starboard," Thomas shouted, seeing the Spanish admiral's intent before anyone else. Goliath's military training had rubbed off on him, teaching him to think several moves ahead in the deadly chess game of naval combat. The Serpent's revenge heeled over sharply as her crew executed the command with the precision of men whose lives depended on perfect coordination. Spanish cannonballs whistled through the space they had occupied moments before, raising towering waterspouts that drenched the privateer crew with spray. "Boarding party, prepare to launch," Thomas commanded, knowing that their only hope lay in seizing the crippled supply ship before the Spanish could organize an effective defense. The treasure fleet's formation was in chaos, but that chaos wouldn't last long once professional officers restored order to their commands. Rodriguez led the boarding party with cutlass in hand and pistols tucked into his belt, his weathered face set with the grim determination of a man who had survived dozens of such actions. Behind him came Mackenzie and Billy Bones, along with a dozen of their most experienced fighters. But it was Goliath who reached the Spanish ship first, launching himself across the gap between vessels with a grace that belied his massive size. The great dog landed on the supply galleon's deck and immediately established a defensive position at the head of the boarding party's route, his presence so imposing that several Spanish sailors backed away in superstitious terror. The battle that followed was brief, but intense, Spanish professionalism clashing with privateer desperation in a whirlwind of steel and courage. Thomas found himself fighting beside men who had become brothers, their coordination so perfect, it seemed almost supernatural. Throughout the action, Goliath moved with the tactical precision of his naval training, never attacking unless absolutely necessary, but positioning himself to protect the privateer's flanks with an intelligence that amazed even the Spanish officers. The dog's presence was like having an additional officer coordinating their movements, someone who understood the flow of battle and could anticipate threats before they developed. The Spanish supply ship's captain, a dignified older man whose uniform bore the decorations of a lifetime service, finally called for quarter when it became clear that further resistance would only lead to unnecessary casualties. His surrender was accepted with the courtesy due to a brave enemy, though Thomas could see the pain in the man's eyes as he handed over his sword. "Secure the prisoners and prepare to get underway," Thomas ordered, knowing that they had only minutes before the Spanish fleet reorganized for a counterattack. Rodriguez, get a prize crew aboard and see what intelligence we can gather from their documents. As the Serpent's Revenge prepared to escort her captured prize to safety, Thomas looked back at the Spanish treasure fleet, still struggling to navigate the Devil's Backbone. They had achieved the impossible, capturing a heavily defended vessel from under the noses of one of Spain's most experienced admirals, but more than tactical victory, they had proven something far more important. The bond between man and dog, forged in loyalty and tempered by shared danger, had become something greater than the sum of its parts. Goliath's training under Admiral Morrison had combined with his devotion to Thomas to create a partnership that elevated everyone around them. The captured Spanish supply galleon proved to be worth far more than anyone had dared hope. Her holds contained not only the expected gunpowder and weapons, but also detailed maps of Spanish fortifications throughout the Caribbean, coded correspondence between colonial governors, and most remarkably, the complete roster of Spanish intelligence agents operating in British territories. Thomas supervised the cataloguing of documents in the galleon's former captain's cabin, while Goliath lay nearby with the patient attention of a creature who understood that paperwork could be as important as cannon fire in determining the outcome of wars. The great dog's presence had become so natural that Spanish prisoners often forgot he was there, sometimes speaking freely in front of him as if he were merely part of the ship's furniture. "This changes everything," Captain Blackwood said as he reviewed the intelligence they had gathered. "These documents detail Spanish plans for the next 2 years of operations. The Admiralty in London will consider this worth a fleet of treasure ships." The immediate tactical situation remained precarious. The Spanish treasure fleet had finally cleared the Devil's Backbone and was now prowling the approaches to their hiding place. Don Carlos Vasquez, clearly unwilling to accept the loss of his supply ship without attempting recovery. 3 British privateers had responded to their signals and were approaching from the northeast, but they were still hours away from providing effective support. "We need to break contact and reach open water," Rodriguez advised from his position at the captured ship's wheel. The former first mate had volunteered to command the prize crew, his decades of experience making him the natural choice for such responsibility. But Goliath had other ideas. The great dog suddenly rose from his resting place and padded over to the chart table where Thomas was planning their escape route. With the deliberate precision that marked all his important communications, Goliath placed his paw on a section of coastline that showed a series of small bays and inlets. Thomas studied the area with growing understanding. The coastline Goliath had indicated was honeycombed with caves and hidden anchorages that could shelter ships from pursuit while offering multiple escape routes to open ocean. More importantly, the approaches were too shallow and treacherous for the deep-draft Spanish galleons to follow. "He's suggesting we go to ground," Thomas said, translating the dog's tactical insight for the others. "Hide in the shallows until the Spanish give up their search, then make our run for friendly waters when they're not expecting it." It was a strategy that played to all their advantages while neutralizing Spanish superiority in firepower and numbers. The local knowledge that came from years of operating in these waters would serve them better than any conventional naval manual, while Goliath's inherited understanding of enemy psychology provided insights no ordinary privateer could claim. The decision proved wise within hours. The Spanish treasure fleet spent the entire day searching the obvious escape routes, while the Serpent's Revenge and her prize lay hidden in a secluded bay, whose existence was known only to smugglers and local fishermen. From their concealed position, they could watch Spanish sails pass within cannon range without being detected themselves. As evening approached, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The frightened boy who had chosen a battle-scarred dog over more conventional prizes seemed like a different person, though the core values that had guided that choice remained unchanged. Every decision since then had been shaped by the partnership between man and dog, each learning from the other, until their combined capabilities exceeded what either could have achieved alone. Goliath appeared at his side with the silent grace that never failed to amaze observers, the great dog's amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. The scars that marked his powerful frame told stories of past service and sacrifice, but they no longer defined him. He had found a new purpose that honored both his training and his heart, becoming something greater than either his original masters or his current family could have imagined. "Tomorrow we'll make our run," Thomas said quietly, his hand moving through the familiar texture of Goliath's thick fur. The other privateers should be in position by then, and the Spanish will have grown tired of searching empty water. The dog's soft whine seemed to acknowledge both the plan and the risks it entailed.